The parietal bones are two bones in the human skull which, when joined together at a The parietal bones are two bones in the human skull which, when joined together at a fibrous joint, form the sides and roof of the cranium. Each bone is roughly quadrilateral in form, and has two surfaces, four borders. The parietal bones are two bones in the human skull which, when joined together at a fibrous joint, form the sides and roof of the cranium. Each bone is roughly quadrilateral in form, and has two surfaces, four borders, and four angles. The occipital bone is a cranial dermal bone, and is the main bone of the occiput back and lower part of the skull. It is trapezoidal in shape and curved on itself like a shallow dish. The occipital bone overlays the occipital lobes of the cerebrum. At the base of the skull in the occipital bone there is a large oval opening called the foramen magnum, which allows the passage of the spinal cord. Like the other cranial bones, it is classed as a flat bone. Due to its many attachments and features, the occipital bone is described. The occipital bone is a cranial dermal bone, and is the main bone of the occiput. The temporal bones are situated at the sides and base of the skull, and lateral to the temporal lobes of the cerebral cortex. The temporal bones are overlaid by the sides of the head known as the temples and house the structures of the ears. The lower seven cranial nerves and the major vessels stand from the brain traverse the temporal bones are situated at the sides and base of the skull, and lateral to the temporal lobes of the cerebral cortex. The temporal bones are overlaid by the sides of the head known as the temples and house the structures of the ears. The lower seven cranial nerves and the major vessels stand from the brain traverse the temporal bone. The sphenoid bone is an unpaired bone of the neurocranium. It is situated in the middle of the skull towards the front, in front of the temporal bone in the basilar part of the occipital bone. The sphenoid bone is one of the seven bones that articulate to form the orbit. Its shape somewhat resembles that of a butterfly or bat with its wings extended. The lateral cartilage, upper lateral cartilage, is situated below the inferior margin of the nasal bone, and is flattened and triangular in shape. Its anterior margin is thicker than the posterior, and is continuous above with the septal nasal cartilage, but separated from it below by a narrow fissure. Its superior margin is attached to the nasal bone and the frontal process of the maxilla. Its inferior margin is connected by fibrous tissue with the greater alar cartilage. Paired cartilages that support the nasal tip, columella, and nostril rims, each consisting of a medial crus within the columella, a middle crus, which extends from the columella's lobular junction to the lateral edge of the tip lobule, and a lateral crus that extends toward the piriform aperture. The axis of the lateral crus normally extends along the line that runs toward the lateral orbital canthus. In the human skull, the zygomatic bone, cheekbone or malar bone, is a paired bone which articulates with the maxilla, the temporal bone, the sphenoid bone and the frontal bone. It is situated at the upper and lateral part of the face and forms the prominence of the cheek, part of the lateral wall and floor of the orbit, and parts of the temporal and infratemporal fossa. It presents a malar and a temporal surface, four processes, the frontospinoidal, orbital, maxillary, and temporal, and four borders. The maxilla in animals is the upper jawbone formed from the fusion of two maxillary bones. The upper jaw includes the frontal portion of the palate of the mouth. The two maxillary bones are fused at the intermaxillary suture. This is similar to the mandible lower jaw, which is also a fusion of two mandibular bones at the mandibular symphysis. The nasal bones are two small oblong bones, varying in size and form in different individuals. They are placed side by side at the middle and upper part of the face, and form, by their junction, the bridge of the nose. The nasal bones are two small oblong. The lacrimal sac is the upper dilated end of the nasolacrimal duct, and is lodged in a deep groove formed by the lacrimal bone and frontal process of the maxilla. It connects the lacrimal canaliculi, which drain tears from the eye's surface, and the nasolacrimal duct, which conveys this fluid into the nasal cavity. The ethmoid bone is an unpaired bone in the skull that separates the nasal cavity from the brain. It is located at the roof of the nose, between the two orbits. The cubicle bone is lightweight due to a spongy construction. The ethmoid bone is one of the bones that make up the orbit of the eye. The vertical part perpendicular plate of the palatine bone is thin, of an oblong form, and presents two surfaces and four borders. The ethmoid bone is an unpaired bone in the skull that separates the nasal cavity from the brain. It is located at the roof of the nose, between the two orbits. In anatomy, a nasal concha pleural conchi, also called a turbinate or turbinal, is a long, narrow, curled shelf of bone that protrudes into the breathing passage of the nose in humans and various animals. The conchi are shaped like an elongated seashell, which gave them their name. A turbinate bone is any of the scrolled spongy bones of the nasal passages in vertebrates. The palatine bones are two irregular bones of the facial skeleton in many animal species. Together with the maxillae they comprise the hard palate. The palatine bones are situated at the back part of the nasal cavity between the maxilla and the pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone. They contribute to the walls of three cavities: the floor and lateral walls of the nasal cavity, the roof of the mouth, and the floor of the orbits. They aid in the formation of the vomer is one of the unpaired facial bones of the skull. It is located in the mid-sagittal line, and articulates with the sphenoid, the ethmoid, the left and right palatine bones, and the left and right maxillary bones. The vomer forms the inferior part of the nasal septum. The mandible, lower jaw or jawbone is the largest, strongest and lowest bone in the face. It forms the lower jaw and holds the lower teeth in place. The mandible sits beneath the maxilla. The mandible is the only movable bone of the skull besides the ossicles of the middle ear. The bone is formed from a fusion of left and right processes, and the point where these sides join, the mandibular symphysis, is still visible as a faint ridge in the midline. Like other symphyses in the body, this is a midline articulation where the bones are joined by fibrocartilage, but this articulation fuses together in early childhood. The hyoid bone, lingual bone or tongue bone, is a horseshoe-shaped bone situated in the anterior midline of the neck between the chin and the thyroid cartilage. At rest, it lies at the level of the base of the mandible in the front and the third cervical vertebra behind. Unlike other bones, the hyoid is only distantly articulated to other bones by muscles or ligaments. The hyoid is anchored by muscles from the anterior, posterior and inferior directions, and aids in tongue movement and swallowing. The hyoid bone provides attachment to the muscles of the floor of the mouth and the tongue above, the larynx below, and the epiglottis and pharynx behind. In anatomy, the atlas C1 is the most superior first cervical vertebra of the spine. It is named for the Atlas of Greek mythology because it supports the globe of the head. The atlas is the In anatomy, the second cervical vertebra, C2, of the spine is named the axis or epistrophius. By the atlantoaxial joint, it forms the pivot upon which the first cervical vertebra, the atlas which carries the head. In vertebrates, cervical vertebrae singular, vertebra are the vertebrae of the neck, immediately below the skull. Thoracic vertebrae in all mammalian species are those vertebrae that also carry a pair of ribs, and lie caudal to the cervical vertebrae. Further caudally follow the lumbar vertebrae, which also belong to the trunk, but do not carry ribs. In reptiles, all trunk vertebrae carry ribs and are In vertebrates, cervical vertebrae singular, vertebra are the vertebrae of the neck, immediately below the skull. In vertebrates, cervical vertebrae singular, vertebra are the vertebrae of the neck, immediately In vertebrates, cervical vertebrae singular, vertebra are the vertebrae of the neck, immediately below the skull. Thoracic In vertebrates, cervical vertebrae singular, vertebra are the vertebrae of the neck, immediately below the skull. Thoracic vertebrae in all mammalian species are those vertebrae that also carry a pair of ribs. In vertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column, In vertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column, between the cervical vertebrae and the In vertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column, between the cervical vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae. In humans, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae and they are intermediate in size between the cervical and lumbar vertebrae. They increase in size going towards the lumbar vertebrae, with the lower ones being a lot larger than the upper. Invertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column. Invertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column, between the cervical vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae. Invertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column, between the cervical vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae. In humans, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae and they are intermediate in size between the cervical and lumbar vertebrae. They increase in size going towards the lumbar vertebrae. Invertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column. Invertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column, between the cervical. Invertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column, between the cervical vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae. Invertebrates, thoracic vertebrae compose the middle segment of the vertebral column. The lumbar vertebrae are, in human anatomy, the 5 vertebrae between the rib cage and the pelvis. They are the largest segments of the vertebral column and are characterized by the absence of the foramen transversarium within the The lumbar vertebrae are, in human anatomy, the 5 vertebrae between the rib cage and the pelvis. They are the largest segments of the vertebra. The lumbar vertebrae are, in human anatomy, the 5 vertebrae between the rib cage and the pelvis. They are the largest segments of the vertebral column. The lumbar vertebrae are, in human anatomy, the 5 vertebrae between the rib cage and the pelvis. They are the largest segments of the vertebral column and are characterized by the absence of the foramen transversarium within the transverse process, as it is only found in the cervical. The scapula shoulder blade or wing bone is the bone that connects the humerus with the clavicle. Like their connected bones, the scapulae are paired, with the scapula on the left side of the body being roughly a mirror image of the right scapula. In early Roman times, people thought the bone resembled a trowel, a small shovel. The shoulder blade is also called omo in Latin medical terminology. Humans have 24 ribs, 12 pairs. The first 7 sets of ribs, known as true ribs, also known as vertebrosternal ribs, are directly. Humans have 24 ribs, 12 pairs. The first 7 sets of ribs, known as true ribs. Humans have 24 ribs, 12 pairs. The first 7 sets of ribs. Humans have 24 ribs, 12 pairs. The first 7 sets of ribs, known as true ribs. Humans have 24 ribs, 12 pairs. The first 7 sets of ribs, known as true ribs, also known as vertebrosternal ribs, are directly attached to the. The manubrium is the broad upper part of the sternum. It has a quadrangular shape, narrowing from the top, which gives it 4 borders. The suprasternal notch is located in the middle at the upper broadest part of the manubrium. This notch can be felt between the two. The sternum or breastbone is a long flat bone shaped like a necktie located in the center of the chest. It connects to the ribs via cartilage, forming the front of the rib cage, and thus helps to protect the heart, lungs, and major blood vessels from injury. The sternum consists of 3. The xiphoid process or xiphisternum or metasternum is a small cartilaginous process of the lower part of the sternum, which is usually ossified in the adult human. It may also be referred to as the ensiform process. Both the Greek-derived xiph. The costal cartilages are bars of hyaline cartilage that serve to prolong the ribs forward and contribute to the elasticity of the walls of the thorax. The humerus is a long bone in the arm or forelimb that runs from the shoulder to the elbow. It connects the scapula and the two bones of the lower arm, the radius and ulna, and consists of 3 sections. The humeral upper extremity consists of a rounded. The radius or radial bone is one of the 2 large bones of the forearm, the other being the ulna. It extends from the lateral side of the elbow to the thumb side of the wrist and runs parallel to the ulna. The ulna is a long bone found in the forearm that stretches from the elbow to the smallest finger, and when in anatomical position, is found on the medial side of the forearm. It runs parallel to the radius, the other long bone in the forearm, and is the larger and The scaphoid bone is one of the carpal bones of the wrist. It is situated between the hand and forearm on the thumb side of the wrist. It forms the radial border of the carpal tunnel. The scaphoid bone is the largest bone of the proximal row of wrist bones, its long axis being from above. In human anatomy, the metacarpal bones or metacarpus form the intermediate part of the skeletal hand located between the phalanges of the fingers and the carpal bones of the wrist, which forms the connection to the forearm. The proximal phalanges hand are the bones that are found at the bottom of the finger. They are named proximal because they are the closest phalanges to the metacarpals. The proximal phalanges hand are the bones that are found at the bottom of the finger. They are named proximal. The palmar ligaments of the The os coxar hip bone is a large flat bone, constricted in the center and expanded above and below. In some vertebrates it is composed of 3 parts, the ilium, ischium, and the pubis. The 2 hip bones join at the pubic symphysis and together with the sacrum and coccyx comprise the skeletal component. The sacrum in human anatomy is a large, triangular bone at the base of the spine, that forms by the fusing of sacral vertebrae S1 S5 between 18 and 30 years. The coccyx, commonly referred to as the tailbone, is the final segment of the vertebral column in humans and apes, and certain other mammals such as horses. In animals with bony tails, it is known as tailhead or dock, in bird anatomy as tailfin. It comprises 3 to 5 separate or fused coccygeal vertebrae below the sacrum. The femur or thigh bone is the most proximal bone of the leg in tetrapod vertebrates capable of walking or jumping, such as most land mammals, birds, many reptiles such as lizards. The patella, also known as the kneecap, is a thick, circular triangular bone which articulates with the femur and covers and protects the anterior articular. The patella, also known as the kneecap, is a thick, circular triangular bone which articulates with the femur and covers and protects the anterior articular surface of the knee. The tibia, also known as the shin bone or shank bone, is the larger and stronger of the 2 bones in the leg below the knee invertebrates, and the fibula or calf bone is a leg bone located on the lateral side of the tibia, with which it is connected above and below. It is the smaller of the 2 bones, and, in proportion to its length, the slenderest of all the long bones. Its upper extremity is small, placed toward the back of the head of the tibia, below the level of the knee joint, and excluded from the formation of this joint. Its lower extremity inclines a little forward, so as to be on a plane anterior to that of the upper end. It projects below the tibia, and forms the lateral part of the ankle joint. The talus bone, astragalus or ankle bone, is one of the group of foot bones known as the tarsus. In humans, the calcaneus or heel bone is a bone of the tarsus of the foot which constitutes the heel. In the human body, the cuboid bone is one of the 7 tarsal bones of the foot. The cuboid bone is the most lateral of the bones in the distal row. The navicular bone in humans is one of the tarsal bones, found in the foot. In the human body, the cuboid bone is one of the 7 tarsal bones of the foot. Proximal phalanges are the largest bones in the toe. They form the base of the toe and are a separate bone from the middle phalange. Proximal phalanges are the largest bones in the toe. They form the base of the toe and are... Proximal phalanges are interphalangeal distal ligaments of the foot left. The middle phalanges are some of the smaller long bones that form the... The distal phalanges foot are located at the end of each toe.